Step 3. Get more out of your textbooks. Reading books is probably one of my favorite things ever, but when reading is assigned, I'm less than enthusiastic about it. Maybe you're the same. Still, a lot of the information you'll need to earn great grades is locked inside required textbooks, so you'll need to read them eventually. Professors tend to assign too much reading though. You usually don't need to pay super close attention to everything you're assigned to learn the necessary information to ace your tests. This chapter will show you how to figure out which reading assignments are actually worth doing, and it'll also guide you through the best strategies for completing those readings quickly and retaining as much important information from them as possible. Don't do all your assigned reading. Here's the thing about assigned reading. You can't do all of it, and you probably shouldn't. Most classes assign way too much reading, and for many classes, the reading isn't even useful to do for one of two reasons. Number 1, the professor will cover the same material in class, or number 2, you won't ever be tested on it. While the material in those textbooks is objectively useful, remember the theme of this book, reducing your study time. Your time in college is extremely limited, especially if you're making good use of it by working on projects, building relationships, staying involved in clubs, etc. Oh, and maybe a bit of time to actually relax as well. Put simply, if your reading assignments aren't absolutely necessary to do, you shouldn't allow yourself the time to do all of them. That time can be better used elsewhere. But how do you figure out which assignments are necessary and which ones aren't? The first piece of advice I can give you is this. Readings can be separated into different categories. 1. Primary readings. 2. Secondary readings. Primary readings generally include the required textbook for the class and possibly other readings based on what you're learning. In general, you should make your best effort to do these readings. Secondary readings are things like smaller books, articles the professor wants you to read, case studies, etc. In my experience, large portions of my grade never hinged on these types of readings, so they were prime candidates for either quick scanning or skipping altogether. The other thing I'll say is to constantly gauge your classes. Be mindful of how much overlap there is between what's presented in class and what's in the textbook. Pay attention to how much of your exams actually focus on things you could only get from the reading. By doing this, you'll be able to intelligently adjust your workload to fit your grade goal as the semester goes on without wasting too much time on reading. Know how you'll be assessed. Gauging your classes isn't just useful for figuring out which reading assignments you can skip. It also helps you figure out how you should tackle individual reading assignments. You can gain this insight by focusing on how you'll be assessed in a specific class. Different classes will have different types of assessments, including multiple choice tests, essays and written questions, data analysis in labs, reports and class presentations. The type of assessment you'll be facing should help you define the specific information you need to pull out of your readings. You can't remember it all, so the most efficient strategy is to figure out precisely what you need to learn and focus on that. For example, Multiple choice tests require you to learn lots of facts and details from your textbook readings. To account for this, you should make sure you focus on bolded terms, definitions, and any specific details that stick out when you're reading. Your reading notes should reflect this as well, and you should later convert them into rapid-fire questions that you can use to quiz yourself. On the other hand, essays require you to have a firm grasp of the main idea of a reading, and you need to be able to summarize it and build off of it in your own words. To prepare for this, it's better to practice honing in on the most salient points of a reading and try to summarize them once you've finished reading. Don't read textbooks like newspapers. People generally read newspapers passively, and they do it just to get the gist of the day's events. If you were to ask someone about specific details they'd read in a newspaper the day after they'd read it, you probably wouldn't get good answers in response. When you read your textbooks, you're reading to learn and apply the information. You're not just trying to get the gist. That's why you should do your best to not read your textbook like you'd read a newspaper. I call students who do this textbook zombies. They're single-mindedly concerned with running their eyes over the assigned pages and then shuffling off to their next planned activity, possibly eating brains? Think of your textbook like an art museum. When I went to New York City last summer, I visited the Metropolitan Museum of Art and walked through almost every exhibit. While I do remember that the Met is the most amazing art museum I've ever been to, I don't really remember the details of the pieces I looked at. That's because I just casually strolled through the halls and looked at the art. I didn't take much time to note down the names of the paintings and who painted them. Just like passively walking through a museum won't give you a detailed knowledge of the art in it, passively running your eyes over the words in a textbook won't help you really learn the material. And trying to reread it multiple times won't yield much of an improvement either. How often you read something is immaterial. How you read it is crucial. Virginia Vakes. Instead of reading passively, read as if you were having a conversation with an intelligent friend. When she talks, you listen intently. When she pauses, you contribute your own ideas and, together, you create new information. You come away feeling energized, not drained. This type of reading is called active reading, and it's the key to dealing with your textbooks in the most effective way. 5 active reading strategies. For decades, professors who all belong to the ultra-secret society of acronym lords, now that I've told you about it, they're coming for you, have been trying to push active reading systems that can be neatly packaged into, you guessed it, tidy little acronyms. These systems, like SQ3R, survey, question, read, recite, review, SQ4R, add, reflect, and others contain some useful techniques. But I think trying to rigidly follow one every time you read is far too time-consuming. I'm not the only one who thinks this. Cal Newport, the founder of the excellent Study Hacks blog, wrote, "I've never met a high-scoring student who used a system like SQ4R. The reason? They're too time-consuming. What these students do instead is discover simple, streamlined, and devastatingly effective heuristics that can be easily adapted to specific classes. The only acronym-based reading system I recommend is scar. Stop complaining and read. So, instead of appeasing the secret acronym society members and recommending a cumbersome system, I'm just going to give you 5 active reading strategies you can adopt as you wish. Note, again, including images of each technique would mess up the formatting of the book, but you can see examples in my active reading video. Use the pseudo-skimming technique. The longer a reading assignment is, the more likely a large portion of its paragraphs will be filler, stuff you don't really need to read. According to Cal Newport, filler paragraphs can include background story, asides, exceptions, because professional scholars want to be thorough, extra details. In many cases, information of these types won't make up the bulk of what you'll be tested over later, so paragraphs containing those types on information should be quickly scanned. However, a good number of paragraphs in any reading will contain important material that you should learn. These paragraphs should be read intently. Enter Cal's pseudo-skimming method. Essentially, you're going through your readings at a staggered pace. One moment, you'll be quickly scanning through paragraphs. The next, you'll notice an important paragraph and slow down to take it in fully. Deliberately attempting to read using the pseudo-skimming method will prevent your brain from automatically giving equal preference to every paragraph in a reading, which, in my case, meant diligently reading each one for the first 10 minutes while my willpower was high, then eventually scanning/skipping as I got further into the chapter and became bored. Read the chapter backwards. Here's the thing about textbook readings. They're usually not suspenseful. They don't have a narrative, and rarely will you spoil yourself by going to the end first. You can take advantage of this by reading backwards. Before you dive into a chapter, flip to the back of it and see what's there. Usually, you'll see a list of key vocab terms, review questions, and other helpful stuff. Use what you find here to prime your brain for the actual reading. Once you've loaded what you can from the review section into the front of your consciousness, you'll be able to pick out those bits more easily when you read them in the actual text. Create questions while you read. One of the concepts I'll be diving deeper into later on in the book is active recall. The practice of forcing your brain to actually retrieve information instead of just passively exposing yourself to it. Doing this helps you learn much more efficiently. An easy way to prep for active recall-based study sessions is to create questions while you do your reading assignments. You should definitely take notes when you read, either during or immediately afterward. And a great way to process these notes for easy studying is to pull details from them and rework them into questions you can quiz yourself on later. In addition to the details from your notes, another great source of questions is the section headings of your actual readings. These generally pull out the main idea of a section, so using them as a basis for a question is a good way to jog your memory of that section's most salient points. Pay attention to formatting. Text in your reading assignments that's bolded, italicized, or sitting nicely in lists should be given special attention. If text has special formatting, it's a good sign that it represents a main idea, vocab term, or important process that you should learn. When I took my marketing class, I actually got to the point where I just scanned through each textbook chapter looking for bolded vocab terms and write them down in my notes. I had figured out that the tests were largely based on these vocab terms along with a few case studies, so I had no need to waste time on all the other details in each chapter of the book. Mark up your book and take notes. Lastly, find a way to make reading a more interactive process by either marking up your books or taking notes on what you're reading. Both of these techniques emphasize active reading over simple, passive exposure, and both will make your later study sessions easier. If you're renting your textbooks, plan to sell them, or otherwise can't permanently mark them up, you can use sticky flags instead to mark important points in your assignments. These can stick out of your book slightly and give you easy access to places you've marked, even when your book is closed. If you can mark up your books, then you can either use a highlighter or a pencil to make permanent markings. I'm generally not a fan of highlighting. As a sort of OCD person, I always found myself spending too much time trying to make my highlighted lines nice and straight. For me, using a pencil works so much better. Not only can you easily underline and bracket important terms, but you can also write short notes in the margins of your book. Remember why Harry Potter's Potions book was so useful in the Half-Blood Prince? Margin notes can really help jog your memory later because they help you connect the reading material to things you already know, making it easier for your brain to solidify your understanding of the topic. Speaking of notes, one last way to get more interactive with your readings is to take actual notes on them in a separate notebook or on your computer. This is where creating questions can come in handy. You can turn your section headings into questions in your notes, then jot down details from those sections with the goal of answering those questions. For most books, my preferred method of taking notes is to worry about them after I finish the reading section. I'll typically read a chapter of a book I'm going through once, then open Evernote and create outline-style notes of all the details I remember. I'm trying to use active recall during this part to maximize my learning. This is what I'm currently doing as I go through The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. Once those details are down, I'll scan through the chapter once more and add anything else I deem important to the notes. However, when I'm digging through textbooks while trying to find specific information, for example, when I'm researching a topic for a new video, I'll have a notebook open while I'm reading and will be jotting down flow-style notes as I go through the book. Summarize what you read. I want to put special emphasis on summarizing, as it's about the most useful implementation of an active recall strategy you can apply to your reading assignments. When you attempt to summarize what you've read, you're digging into your brain and pulling out the information for, essentially, the task of teaching what you read. You may have heard of the learning pyramid before. The learning pyramid. Average retention rates: 5% lecture, 10% reading, 20% audio-visual, 30% demonstration, 50% discussion, 75% practice, 90% teach others. Now, many experts disagree about the accuracy and validity of the learning pyramid, and I wouldn't venture to claim that the percentages listed on it are completely accurate. There are a ton of factors that go into how well you can retain information, not least of which is the actual nature of the information itself. Our brains are weird and built upon millions of years of odd, non-logical evolution. So the way they remember facts about math won't be the same they remember facts about the ninja creeping up behind you. Still, both sense and my own experience tell me that the bottom of the pyramid is more or less right. Teaching something results in higher retention in your own brain. This is because you're intensely processing the information with the goal of being able to communicate it in a form that will be understandable to someone less knowledgeable than you. Summarizing does this really well, so it's a perfect strategy for efficiently learning the most important material from your readings. As I noted above, I tried to summarize what I learned from each chapter in The Power of Habit by trying to type out bulleted notes from memory before going back through the chapter and fleshing them out. You can do this as well. Though if the reading you're doing is for a class that'll be assessing you with essays, it might be better to try typing out your notes in paragraph form, at least for sections and assignments you deem to be especially important, which means you should definitely be paying close attention to your syllabus and what your professor says.